early October 2025, the Russian Labor Ministry quietly confirmed what economists had been warning for months. Russia's industrial backbone is cracking under the weight of its own demographic collapse. A confidential report presented to President Vladimir Putin by Labor Minister Anton Kochetkov admitted that by 2030, Russia would face a shortage of over 3 million skilled workers. The admission stunned even pro-Kremlin analysts. How did a nation that once prided itself on full employment reach this point of irreversible decay? This revelation has shaken the foundation of the Kremlin's post-war narrative. Official television still shows images of humming factories and young workers, but behind those polished frames lie empty workshops and aging machinery. The domino effect perspective becomes evident here. One broken link in Russia's labor chain has triggered widespread paralysis. A single unfilled engineering post halts tank assembly. A shortage of welders delays gas pipeline repairs. And when hospitals can't find surgeons, even civilian morale erodes. Could this quiet crisis, not the battlefield, become Putin's ultimate undoing? According to Reuters and BBC reports from late September 2025, Russia's unemployment rate remains artificially low, around 2.4%. But this figure masks an economy starving for human capital. The central bank itself has acknowledged that productivity has stagnated, wages are rising faster than output, and industries are cannibalizing each other for scarce talent. In short, what appears to be a labor boom is actually a warning signal of system failure. Factories that once ran 3 shifts now run 1. Trains are idled for lack of maintenance crews. Even Moscow's construction sites, symbols of the capital's wealth, echo with silence. The opportunity cost perspective reveals another layer of the crisis. Every resource Moscow diverts to keep production lines running through wage subsidies, housing incentives, or propaganda drives comes at the expense of its war machine. The Kremlin's decision to sustain arms manufacturing means cutting investment in civilian sectors, which further shrinks living standards. Meanwhile, each mobilized soldier represents not only a life at risk, but a missing technician, teacher, or engineer back home. As defense news analysts wrote this week, Russia is not just fighting a war in Ukraine, it is bleeding out its workforce. The loss of skilled youth is worsening. UN demographic data and DW analysis show that since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the population of men aged 20-35 has fallen sharply due to battlefield deaths, emigration, and declining births. Between 2022 and 2024, roughly 700,000 educated Russians fled abroad, a migration unseen since the Soviet collapse. And unlike the 1990s, these aren't just dissidents. They are programmers, engineers, and doctors. Every one of them takes a portion of Russia's future growth potential with them. From a strategic contrast perspective, Putin's ambition to project strength abroad now undermines his capacity to sustain it at home. The Kremlin sought to rebuild empire, but instead has crippled the domestic foundation that makes imperial ambition possible. Factories once designed to arm Russia's expansion now stand as monuments to its internal exhaustion. What happens when a nation that dreams of military dominance can't even build its own infrastructure? Western experts note that this demographic implosion carries consequences far beyond Russia's borders. NATO planners are quietly studying the long-term security implications. A weakened, aging, and economically unstable nuclear power introduces unpredictable risks. If industrial decline deepens, Moscow may double down on coercive diplomacy or hybrid warfare to compensate for its shrinking strength. The picture emerging is one of a country cornered by its own contradictions, a superpower trapped in demographic quicksand. What began as a slow leak in the labor market has become a full-blown collapse, threatening Russia's social and military stability. Yet this is only the beginning. As the Kremlin struggles to fill the gaps, A new exodus is already reshaping the nation's class structure and its future identity. Who are the people leaving, and what does their departure reveal about the system itself? Meanwhile, the next chapter in Russia's unraveling begins not on the battlefield, but at the airports and train stations crowded with the young minds it can no longer keep. By mid-October 2025, Moscow's airports once again filled with anxious faces, young engineers, IT specialists, and doctors clutching one-way tickets to Istanbul, Tbilisi, and Berlin. Russia's so-called brain drain has turned into a demographic hemorrhage. Since the invasion of Ukraine, more than 700,000 educated Russians have fled the country, according to figures compiled by Reuters and DW. Some call it a search for freedom, others sheer survival. But behind every departing passenger lies a deeper question: what kind of country drives away its own future? Even Kremlin insiders admit the scale of this flight. A leaked memo reviewed by the New York Times described how Russia's technology sector lost over one-third of its software developers between 2022 and 2024. Their absence has rippled through industries that once prided themselves on self-reliance: aviation, banking, cybersecurity. Here, the domino effect perspective becomes strikingly visible. The departure of a handful of coders disrupts entire logistics networks. The shutdown of a design bureau halts weapon modernization projects. And when these delays accumulate, Russia's war machine stumbles. One vanished generation of specialists can paralyze the state. On the surface, Putin's administration insists that patriotic replacements are being trained through fast-track programs. Yet independent economists told BBC News that these crash courses produce workers with shallow skills, creating what they call a competence bubble. The opportunity cost perspective reveals how costly that bubble truly is. To replace each departing expert, Moscow spends billions of rubles subsidizing new training centers and relocation incentives funds, diverted from hospitals, schools, and social benefits. Every ruble spent plugging the talent leak is one less for domestic stability. The exodus has also warped Russia's class structure. Middle-income professionals, the very group that once fueled consumer demand and urban innovation, are disappearing. Without them, small businesses collapse, housing markets freeze, and entire regional economies shrink. In cities like Yekaterinburg and Novosibirsk, Al Jazeera's correspondents found empty office towers and ghost neighborhoods once bustling with tech startups. This internal desertification is not merely economic, it's psychological. People no longer believe they have a stake in the system, notes political sociologist Ekaterina Shulman. From the strategic contrast perspective, the irony deepens. Putin claims to defend Russia from Western decadence, yet his own citizens are enriching the very countries he condemns. German companies now recruit Russian engineers to reinforce Europe's energy grid. Baltic nations absorb thousands of IT workers who once built Kremlin networks. The talent Moscow loses becomes the West's strategic gain, a reversal of the Cold War dynamic. NATO analysts quoted by Defense News even argue that this migration has a deterrent effect. Every Russian engineer who joins a Western firm strengthens our resilience while weakening theirs. The cultural loss is equally profound. Universities report dwindling enrollment, theaters struggle to find staff, and even the film industry, once a soft power tool, is in retreat. A generation raised on Soviet nostalgia is watching its children seek futures abroad. This, experts warn, erodes the very myth of national greatness that sustains Putin's legitimacy. How long can propaganda fill the gap left by real human capital? According to a World Bank update in late 2025, remittances from Russians abroad now exceed foreign investment inflows into the country, a first in post-Soviet history. The Kremlin's attempt to tax expatriates has backfired, prompting even more to renounce citizenship. Each exit weakens Moscow's fiscal base, pushing it closer to economic isolation. As one former Roscosmos engineer told DW, "We were told we were building rockets for the future. Now we're just trying to escape gravity." His words capture a wider disillusionment spreading across Russia's shrinking professional class, a realization that their ambitions can no longer take flight at home. But while Russia's best minds pack their bags, the burden of keeping the system afloat shifts to those who remain the aging, the undertrained, and the overworked. What happens when the engines of an entire economy are left in the hands of a generation that's already past its prime? Yet, as the young depart and the old remain, the next stage of Russia's crisis unfolds in its hospitals, factories, and classrooms, places once full of promise, now echoing with silence. In late October 2025, new data from Russia's Federal Statistics Service revealed another grim milestone. The country's median age has climbed to 42.8 years, the highest in modern Russian history. The gray wave, as demographers now call it, is overwhelming every corner of national life. Factories struggle to find operators young enough to manage heavy machinery. Hospitals lack doctors under 50. Even schools in regional towns have begun hiring retired teachers to fill empty classrooms. The question now haunting Moscow's planners is simple: can an aging nation still power a modern state? The domino effect perspective exposes the mechanism of decline. The loss of young workers doesn't just slow production, it cascades through entire systems. In the industrial city of Nizhny Tagil, one missing team of metallurgists forced an assembly line shutdown. That delay rippled to rail exports, which in turn cut regional tax revenue. The result: local hospitals postponed renovations for lack of funds, and public transit services reduced operations. Each missing worker becomes a domino, tipping over dozens more. Russia's economy is operating like a car, with half its cylinders misfiring, a Moscow-based economist told Reuters this week. Meanwhile, healthcare and mortality are feeding a vicious cycle. Reports from Deutsche Welle and The Guardian confirm that male life expectancy, already among the lowest in Europe, fell again in 2024, driven by alcoholism, war injuries, and collapsing rural clinics. Nearly 18% of the population is now over 65, projected to reach 24% by 2050. This surge turns the state's pension fund into a ticking fiscal bomb. The opportunity cost perspective shows that every ruble spent on pensions and war veterans' benefits is one that can't go toward industrial renewal. The Kremlin faces an impossible equation: support its elders or rebuild its factories, but not both. Russia's social services are crumbling under the strain. In Kazan, a hospital administrator interviewed by Al Jazeera admitted that 3 out of 10 surgery units operate without certified anesthesiologists. Rural schools in the Volga region now close 2 days a week for lack of teachers. "We are cannibalizing our own institutions," lamented an education official. To fill vacancies, the government has even shortened medical and technical training programs, another short-term fix that produces underqualified graduates and heightens systemic fragility. From a strategic contrast perspective, this aging crisis directly undermines Putin's global ambitions. He boasts of reviving Soviet-era military power, yet the factories that build his missiles are staffed by pensioners. Western analysts note the contradiction between Russia's rhetoric of strength and its visible human exhaustion. A defense news briefing in Washington described it bluntly: Russia is waging a 21st century war with a 20th century workforce. The crisis reaches beyond economics. Cultural institutions, research centers, even space exploration programs are being drained of vitality. Roscosmos postponed 2 lunar missions because of crew shortages and technical staff losses. Universities cut graduate research by 40%. The moral weight of decline is palpable. A society once proud of its scientific prowess now watches its laboratories dim. Internationally, this deterioration doesn't go unnoticed. NATO's strategic planners quoted in the Financial Times warn that an aging, unstable Russia could become more unpredictable. As its human capital collapses, Moscow might rely increasingly on automation, cyber warfare, or even tactical nuclear threats to compensate for demographic weakness. The risk isn't merely a weaker Russia, but a desperate one. And yet, within Russia, propaganda still paints a portrait of resilience. Glossy TV segments show grandmothers volunteering for tank production or retirees returning to classrooms. The narrative borders on tragic comedy, a nation celebrating survival because it can no longer afford youth. The larger picture is stark, a country losing not just people but time. Each passing year raises the cost of recovery, and every funeral marks another lost engineer, teacher, or doctor. The future is aging faster than the Kremlin can plan. Still, the government insists it has a plan, a renewed reliance on migrant labor to fill the void. But will this stop the bleeding or spark new tensions that could tear Russian society further apart? Yet as the Kremlin turns outward for answers, a new question emerges. Can foreign hands rebuild a nation whose spirit is already fading? By early November 2025, Moscow's skyline told a different story than its propaganda. Cranes stood still, concrete mixers sat idle, and construction sites buzzed, not with machinery, but with bureaucrats scrambling to import labor. The Kremlin's latest solution to its collapsing workforce, mass recruitment of migrant laborers from Central Asia and Africa, was faltering. Officially, the Interior Ministry claims there are 3.2 million legal foreign workers in Russia. But Reuters estimates the figure peaked a decade ago at more than twice that number. The flow has reversed. For the first time in modern history, Russia is losing more laborers than it attracts. Could the empire that once drew millions now be repelling them? This reversal exemplifies the domino effect perspective. When Russia's factories and farms run short of workers, supply chains seize up. When infrastructure projects freeze, investors flee. And when migrants stop coming, even essential industries, transport, construction, and logistics grind to a crawl. It's not just an employment issue, it's an existential one. A Ministry of Transport official, quoted by DW, warned that without foreign labor, Russia's logistics backbone could collapse within 3 years. Each unbuilt bridge, each delayed railway project, pushes the economy further toward paralysis. At first, Putin's government sought to mask the shortage by opening new migration channels from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. But the opportunity cost perspective reveals the hidden trade-offs. Maintaining control over an increasingly diverse workforce requires expensive surveillance programs, new housing, and greater policing of ethnic tensions. Every ruble spent monitoring migrants is one not spent on rebuilding domestic education or health sectors. And the longer Moscow leans on imported labor, the less incentive it has to reform the failing systems that drove its citizens away. The strategic contrast perspective cuts even deeper. While Putin portrays Russia as a global power resisting Western influence, it is quietly becoming dependent on the very regions it once dominated. Analysts at Al Jazeera note that Central Asia now has leverage unseen since Soviet times. Countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, buoyed by Chinese and Turkish investment, can afford to reject Russian recruitment drives. As a result, Russia's economy, long powered by imported hands, is now being strangled by its own reputation. Rising xenophobia has worsened the crisis. After the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack earlier this year, state media turned suspicion on migrant communities. Raids, detentions, and hate crimes have surged, driving thousands to flee or hide. A joint NYT-BBC investigation found that more than 600,000 foreign workers left Russia between January and September 2025. In their absence, wage inflation has soared, small businesses have shuttered, and rural agriculture faces an unprecedented labor drought. The so-called saviors of the Russian economy have become scapegoats. This societal backlash carries dangerous implications. Analysts from The Guardian and Defense News warn that the Kremlin's reliance on authoritarian control to manage internal unrest could ignite ethnic conflicts within major cities like Moscow and Yekaterinburg. Russia risks trading a labor crisis for a cultural one, notes political scientist Mark Galeotti. The irony is striking. The government that calls itself a protector of traditional values now depends on imported workers to keep its cities running. Meanwhile, the West watches carefully. For NATO strategists, the demographic strain weakens Russia's capacity to sustain long-term military production. Western intelligence assessments leaked in late October suggest that Russia's missile assembly rates have fallen by 15% since mid-2024, largely due to skilled labor shortages. With oil and gas exports shrinking and infrastructure decaying, Moscow's dream of economic self-sufficiency looks increasingly hollow. Inside Russia, resentment grows. Older citizens fear cultural dilution. Younger ones blame the state for erasing their prospects. In provincial towns, locals grumble that Moscow is importing strangers instead of fixing the real problems: low wages, corruption, and endless war. It's a dangerous brew of economic frustration and nationalist anger. Still, the Kremlin presses forward, desperate to maintain the illusion of control. Official TV segments now feature smiling migrant workers praising Russia's opportunity. But off-camera, they describe exploitation, withheld pay, and daily racism. The propaganda can't hide the truth. Russia's demographic lifeline is fraying. And as winter sets in, the broader question looms: how long can Putin's regime keep patching its economy with foreign labor before the seams burst? Yet beyond Russia's borders, Western analysts are already preparing for the geopolitical consequences of this decay. What happens when a nuclear-armed state begins to hollow out from within? By mid-November 2025, NATO briefings in Brussels began sounding an unexpected alarm, not about new offensives in Ukraine, but about Russia's collapsing workforce. Western intelligence agencies, drawing from satellite imagery and leaked industrial data, concluded that Moscow's ability to sustain its war economy was eroding faster than anticipated. The tanks are rolling, a senior NATO analyst told Defense News, but the people who build and maintain them are vanishing. The question now troubling Washington and Berlin alike was no longer if Russia would weaken, but how unstable it might become when it does. From the domino effect perspective, Russia's demographic collapse is reverberating through its military-industrial complex. A shortage of skilled machinists in Tula delays artillery shell production. That delay slows ammunition deliveries to the Donbass front. Those shortages, in turn, force battlefield retreats. One missing welder in a tank plant translates weeks later into lost ground on the front line. Reuters estimates that output in key defense factories has dropped by 12% since early 2024, while maintenance delays on armored vehicles have doubled. The dominoes once tipped now tumble across every link in the war chain. The opportunity cost perspective highlights the price of this attrition. To keep weapons flowing, Moscow is diverting vast funds from civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, even pensions. In a single year, defense spending surged past 7% of GDP, while construction budgets were slashed by half. The Kremlin's gamble is clear: sacrifice tomorrow's stability for today's survival. Yet Western economists warn that this trade-off will haunt Russia for decades. They are mortgaging their demographic future to pay for a geopolitical illusion, noted economist Anders Oslund in a BBC Newsnight interview. In Washington, President Donald Trump, who has maintained a wary but transactional stance toward Moscow, has ordered intelligence reviews on how Russia's labor implosion might alter the global balance. The strategic contrast perspective is at play. Putin launched his invasion to prove strength, yet each new offensive drains the very lifeblood of that strength. His dream of restoring empire now competes with the reality of an empty factory floor and a shrinking population. Even within Russia's general staff, quiet doubts are growing. Leaked communications intercepted by Western agencies suggest senior officers are warning the Kremlin that human resource deficits may soon make sustained offensives impossible. NATO planners are adapting accordingly. According to DW and Al Jazeera defense correspondents, alliance war games in Poland and Romania now model scenarios where Russia's internal decline leads to unpredictable regional behavior, cyber provocations, energy blackmail, or sudden troop withdrawals. The alliance's concern is not a stronger Russia, but a desperate one. A state losing its economic and demographic core can lash out unpredictably, seeking leverage through chaos. Meanwhile, the European energy sector feels the ripple. Russia's labor shortages have slowed maintenance at Siberian pipelines and Arctic LNG terminals. The Guardian reported this month that gas output fell another 6% year-over-year, deepening the strain on Moscow's budget. For Europe, that shortfall confirms a strategic turning point. Dependence on Russian energy is no longer viable even for Russia itself. NATO economists frame this as the self-sanction, a collapse born not of embargoes, but of exhaustion. In private forums, Western analysts debate whether sanctions should tighten further or simply wait for time to finish the job. The consensus, according to the Financial Times, is patience. Russia's economy is decaying from the inside out. The West's task is to prevent the fallout from spilling over. Yet that fallout may come sooner than expected. Rising unemployment among veterans, growing protests over unpaid wages, and regional strikes hint at social instability the Kremlin cannot suppress indefinitely. And so, while Putin proclaims victory narratives on state television, NATO strategists see a ticking clock. Each month that passes without industrial recovery accelerates the decay of Russia's war machine. Every new conscription wave drains another segment of its working-age population. The line between battlefield and factory floor grows ever thinner. Still beyond strategy tables and policy briefings lies a more volatile question. What happens when a nuclear power begins to rot faster than it can fight? Yet even as Western capitals ponder containment, the real countdown has already begun inside Russia itself. The next chapter is not about war abroad, but survival at home. By December 2025, Russia's state television still aired triumphalist parades and patriotic songs, but the silence inside its factories told a different story. Across the Ural industrial belt, machine tools lay idle power grids flickered from neglect, and regional governors quietly pleaded for labor imports that never came. The Labor Ministry's 2030 projection, a shortage of 3.1 million skilled workers, was no longer a forecast. It was unfolding in real time. The once mighty workshop of Eurasia had become a skeleton of its former self. Could this internal erosion succeed where sanctions and diplomacy have failed by bringing Russia to its knees from within? The domino effect perspective now plays out on a national scale. A single unfilled post in an oil refinery halts shipments to a rail depot. The rail delays postpone energy exports. The lost revenue forces cuts in social programs, further depressing morale and fertility. From one factory to the next, the dominoes fall with mechanical precision. Analysts at Reuters and DW describe it as a cascading failure of institutions. Entire towns in Siberia, once built around industrial plants, now face depopulation. Satellite images confirm growing patches of darkness at night, where production once thrived. The opportunity cost perspective reveals how Moscow's attempts to reverse the collapse only deepen it. To incentivize births, Putin's administration introduced low-interest housing loans and extended parental benefits. But as The Guardian reports, the funding for these programs comes from cuts to infrastructure and education. Each ruble meant to create new life ends up eroding the systems that make life sustainable. Meanwhile, military mobilization continues to drain young men from the labor pool, with nearly 1.2 million soldiers rotating through the Ukrainian front since 2022. Economists warn that even if the war ended tomorrow, the demographic gap is now too wide to close within a generation. The strategic contrast perspective exposes the ultimate irony. Putin began this war to expand Russia's influence, but in doing so, he has undermined the very capacity to sustain his empire. A shrinking population, a hollowed economy, and a restless society now define the nation that once sought to reshape Europe. Western experts argue that Russia's fate is turning into a geopolitical cautionary tale. They aimed for Kiev, one NATO advisor told Al Jazeera, and instead struck their own future. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration views this decline as both an opportunity and a risk. A weakened Russia reduces global pressure on NATO's eastern flank, yet also increases the danger of instability across Eurasia. A recent defense news briefing emphasized that a collapsing Russia could fragment into zones of competing authority, posing risks for nuclear control and regional migration. The Pentagon has reportedly drafted contingency plans to secure atomic sites should Moscow's command structure falter. The goal is not triumph, but containment, managing a slow implosion that could reshape global security. Inside Russia, social tension simmers. Pension funds are collapsing, regional protests grow bolder, and young families are fleeing to Kazakhstan or Georgia. There's no one left to teach, to heal, to build, lamented a Moscow school principal to BBC News. We are aging faster than we are living. Analysts warn that by 2035, the active labor force could shrink by up to 20%, locking the economy into permanent stagnation. Culturally, the rot runs deeper. Once proud industrial cities are fading into ghost towns. Former miners in Kemerovo sell scrap metal to survive. Rural doctors moonlight as taxi drivers. Each personal tragedy adds weight to the broader collapse, a portrait of a nation devouring its own future. The Kremlin's propaganda machine still insists that Russia endures, but endurance has morphed into exhaustion. The consequences extend beyond Russia's borders. A hollowed Russian state could trigger mass migration, regional instability, and uncontrolled proliferation risks. As the world watches this slow-motion decline, the question is no longer whether Putin will win in Ukraine, but whether he can keep his own country from unraveling before his eyes. Yet as the lights dim across Russia's industrial heartland, one haunting question remains. Can any regime rebuild its empire when its people have already given up on